This is a shelter in the time of storm. We welcome you to our program today. My name is Roger Comstock. I'm the minister for the Morrison Church of Christ in Morrison, Tennessee. This program was designed with the idea of trying to help people through the difficult storms that they face in life. Our program today is a very difficult subject, and I suspect will touch many families. This program and the next two or three, we're going to be talking about suicide and how it affects our families, how it affects children, how it affects those who are the survivors after a suicide has taken place. In our nation, suicides are quite prevalent, obviously. There's approximately one suicide about every 15 minutes. So just in the space of this program, somewhere in this nation, 2 people will likely commit suicide, based on the averages. It comes out to about 99 per day, which in essence comes out to nearly 36,000 per year. 36,000 people per year just in the United States take their own lives. That comes to for a statistical data, I guess you would say, that's a rate of about 12 out of every 100,000 people. Obviously, this is a serious problem and it's something that we need to address. It's very difficult, very serious for the families that remain after one has taken their own life. Suicide ranks 10th among the causes of death in our country. That statistic rather surprised me. It is 10th, and above it are things like heart disease and diabetes and cancer and things like that, which sort of surprised me a little bit. It ranks 10th among causes of death here in the United States. Homicide, murder, ranks 15th here in this country. So that tells you a little bit about the importance of the subject and the difficulty of the issues that surround it. Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among young people. That in itself ought to alarm us. It ought to wake us up. It ought to grab our attention, knowing that so many of our young people are taking their own lives. These are situations and things that we need to address in our families, in our churches, in our schools. We need to recognize some of the warning signs. So in the beginning of each of these programs, we're going to talk about some just facts about suicide, and then we'll talk about specific situations for families and children and so forth. We need to recognize also that with every suicide, there are about 6 individuals, on average now, based on statistics, there are about 6 people that are affected by that suicide, whether family members, close friends, someone with a close relationship of some kind to the one who has committed the suicide. Women attempt suicide 3 times more often than men, which is rather interesting also. 3 times more than men, they attempt suicide. But what's also interesting is that men are more successful 4 times more often than women are. And I say more successful. They succeed at taking their own life 4 times more frequently than women do. Again, tells us with men and women the seriousness of the problem. Suicide is common among women, particularly who are single, women who have recently divorced or recently separated, and oftentimes women who are recently widowed. The traumatic nature of all of those situations, particularly divorce and the death of a spouse, would certainly be a factor, indicators of how serious this problem is and how devastating divorce and death are to a marriage relationship. Suicide rates among men rise considerably after age 65. The highest rate of all age groups in our nation, the highest age group, the most likely, or the highest rate of suicide, I guess I should say, the highest rate of all is among elderly men. And again, maybe our lives and what's going on in their lives tells us a little bit about the cause of that problem. The rate of suicide of men over 65 is 7 times higher than the rate of women over 65 years of age. suicide rates are lower among poorer nations. It seems rather contradictory, doesn't it? You would think in this great nation of ours, with all of the blessings we have and all of the prosperity that we enjoy and the good life that we enjoy, you would think we would have the lowest rate of suicide of any nation. But yet, third world countries, people who live in poverty, have very much lower rates of suicide on the national scale than we do here in the United States. It's interesting that rarely does a slave commit suicide, one who is an indentured servant. And no, that's not something we're familiar with a lot in this country, but it's still prevalent around the world. But even in the years in the past when sadly slavery was used in this nation, rarely would a slave commit suicide. Well, there are certainly some factors involved there because of the differences. Here we are in a very wealthy society, and yet our suicide rates are high. Among poor nations and people who are in poverty, the suicide rates are much lower. You see, being blessed with great wealth and having all the things being an affluent society really may not always be a blessing after all. There are more suicides among white-collar workers and less suicides among blue-collar workers and people who do manual labor and farmers and so forth. They have a much lower suicide rate than that of those who would be considered white-collar workers. More than 90% of the people, again, let me mention, just sort of a disclaimer, there's some controversy or some different opinions among the researchers about this particular fact. Mental illness comes into play, obviously, in the discussion of suicide. Some say that up to 90% of those who commit suicide have a treatable, diagnosable psychiatric disorder of some kind. And there are others who contend that rate of 90% would be much, much less. And so we'll talk at another time about the difficulty of the statistical data. But depression is a major cause, and that certainly can be tied to a psychiatric disorder, mental illness. And you know, at one time in our society, in our nation, talking about mental illness was sort of taboo. We need to recognize that people with mental illness cannot help that any more than a person that has cancer. There are some connecting things that people, because of abuses to their physical body, can bring on some psychiatric disorders because of alcoholism and drug abuse and so forth. But by and large, mental illness is not something that is controllable by an individual any more than cancer or heart disease or diabetes. And so mental illness is something that we need to talk about. We need to talk about in our families. It used to be the brunt of jokes. We need to talk seriously about mental illness because depression, particularly, and manic depression affects many, many families around our nation. There are those in that same category, I guess you would say. There are those also who are diagnosed as having what is referred to as bipolar disorder or bipolar depression. Bipolar simply means that there's great fluctuation, highs and great lows, and no predictability to it. Some are able to be helped with medications, but oftentimes it is just out of control. Sadly, some of those people, because of that out-of-control aspect of their mental illness, sometimes they see suicide as a viable alternative, as the only relief to their situation and the illness that they struggle from. As we mentioned, alcohol abuse and dependence certainly is a factor in suicide as well, as is drug abuse, as we've already mentioned, and drug dependence. Sometimes those who are drug dependent get so desperate as maybe they're legitimately, sincerely trying to quit, trying to break that habit and that reliance on drugs. They get very desperate sometimes, and sadly, sometimes they also take their own lives. You're familiar with the term schizophrenia. Oftentimes, people who suffer from schizophrenia will take their own lives. And part of the, it's rather interesting. It seems to me, and this is not a scientific study, but it seems to me just from my observation, one of the major problems in dealing with mental illness is keeping the person who has the illness on the medications. It seems as though that's a real battle for those who are in the healthcare profession. And people who suffer from mental illness they just seem to not want to stay on the medications that maybe have been prescribed that would help their particular situation. You've heard recently, particularly with soldiers coming home from battle situations, you've heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes people with this mental illness, this disorder, they sometimes rely on suicide as their only out, as their only relief. Eating disorders, those things also contribute to the statistical data concerning suicide, that people who literally starve themselves to death, many of those certainly could be categorized as a suicide. There are personality disorders, multiple personality disorders and so forth that come into play as well. We live in sort of an instant world, an instant society. We want instant gratification when we want to enjoy life, the pleasures of life and so forth. We want instant gratification. And sadly also, we want instant relief. Well, that instant relief isn't always so instant. And sometimes people who are seeking relief from a situation in their life, a situation in their family, whatever it may be, sometimes they get so desperate because they're so used to the instant fix that they get desperate and they don't have the patience to wait for things to be rectified and fixed in a family situation. We have the idea, we go to the doctor, just give me a pill and that'll take care of it. And sadly, that isn't always the remedy. The grieving connected with suicide is also very complicated and also oftentimes quite severe. If you can sort of understand that kind of a situation, that the sudden acute nature of the loss and the grief then connected to it are often very, very deep and take many, many weeks and months, maybe even years, to resolve those differences and those problems with grieving in their individual lives. Some sort of get stuck. If I would sort of compare it to like driving on ice. You just sit there and spin sometimes in the wintertime when we see ice on the road. You just sit there and spin and you don't go anywhere. Sometimes that's what happens with people who are grieving. They sort of get stuck in the process of working their way through, and they lose maybe whatever momentum and whatever they're gaining on this process. They sort of just get stuck and come to a halt at a certain point. Some of the same symptoms or the phases, if you will, some call them stages, not a term I like, but some of the things that affect people who are grieving because of a suicide are like typical grieving, but as I've said, more acute, more severe. Shock is a major problem in dealing with the grief of a suicide. The suddenness of the situation, the devastation, the unexpected nature of it, all of that applies to the shock. And just like our physical bodies go into shock in certain situations, like for example, if you're in a car accident and you have some physical injury, or if you're just in the accident, sometimes with no injury at all, our body can go into shock. Same thing happens to us mentally sometimes. Our brain sort of goes into shock when it goes into an overload. It's like a circuit breaker gets thrown because it's overloaded, and we go into shock. And we just at a point where we're just not able to deal with those things. Our mind being in shock is just like our physical body being in shock. It's as if our mind is anesthetized and as if it's just it's there, but it's just not functioning. That's the best way I know how to describe the shock that comes. With that shock, sometimes there are physical symptoms also. There are physical maladies that come with the shock of a devastating situation. Maybe a loss of appetite, a loss of the ability to sleep. There may be restlessness. There may be even nausea and nervousness and so forth. Some things that would happen to the physical body, not just the mental part of us. There are a lot of questions that arise during that time of shock. And sometimes you've heard me, and maybe in other programs, we've referred to the woulda, shoulda, couldas. That's a major factor, as we'll talk about in the grieving process, when a suicide is the cause of the grief, the cause of the loss. Questions like, why did this happen? Sometimes, how could God let this happen? What did I do to cause this? Those are the questions people ask. What could I have done to prevent it? Is this my fault? Should I have seen the warning signs? Those all are questions that come into play, primarily during that time of shock. Closely tied to that time of shock is what we would refer to certainly as denial. That this just cannot be happening. That just can't be happening to my family, and just refuse to believe. I just don't believe my husband, my wife, my son, my daughter. I just can't believe that they would do such a thing. It's interesting also that in some ways there is a relief involved in some situations. We'll talk about guilt in a moment, but we need to recognize too that sometimes the relief that comes at a time of a suicide, if it's been an extended battle within a family, there sometimes is some relief, and then people feel guilty about that relief that they felt. Not all deaths are unwelcome, whether it's mental illness and by the hand of one who commits suicide, or in physical illnesses. Death is not always the worst thing that can happen, but suicide certainly is devastating. Relief often triggers guilt, as I mentioned a moment ago. There needs to be a time of what we refer to as catharsis. Catharsis is sort of a purging, a time that you just get it all out. It's sort of a purifying sort of action, that the shock wears off and it all becomes very real, maybe at the time of a funeral and those events connected to the loss of life and this particular suicide situation. Sometimes that catharsis will manifest itself in just an overwhelming flood of emotions that come. And sometimes it's almost like an emotional riot, an emotional mob scene, that emotion just overtakes a person. That's a cathartic time and really is somewhat healthy, somewhat good for the person who is suffering from the grief of this situation. Emotions, they need to come out. I personally believe, and I think we could show from certain different scenarios that have happened in life, those emotions almost always will come out sometime. And it's better if we just get those out at the time of our grieving and in the beginning of this loss process. And get that out and deal with those things and allow the pain that's involved to be exhibited. No emotion should be forbidden. No one should ever say to another person, well, you shouldn't be crying or you shouldn't feel that way. That's not up to you. Feelings are very personal, and as we've said in other programs, feelings are just feelings. Something I learned from Brother Bill McDonald. Feelings are just feelings. It's what we do with those feelings that can determine whether it's good or bad. So we need to let those things out. It's okay to sort of come unglued, but then as we begin to put the pieces back together is that growth process and working through the grieving that's involved. There certainly is depression involved and I guess of what are typically referred to as the stages of grieving. Depression is probably the longest as far as time is concerned. Depression may last for months and months. I recommend that people not treat it with medications. I think the natural process needs to come into play. If the depression is so severe that a person can't be functional, then maybe medications would be warranted. but medications like Valium and other things that just suppress and they put a person into a sort of a stupor, put them into where they're almost like they're in a fog. That's not beneficial to the grieving process. But that depression, it's based in the denial and the shock and all of those things that work together. Depression, as I said, will likely last for, sometimes will last for months and months. Some sort of get stuck. We talked about that earlier in the program. Some sort of get stuck in that depression and never get out of it. Some even rule out the possibility that their life can ever have any significant meaning again. That basically they're going to continue living, but in essence their attitude is, my life is over. That's the symptom of depression and some of what goes with that. Some of the despair, in that time of despair, in that time of depression, some people will even take their life as well, or maybe attempt suicide, based in that depression caused by the suicide of another. Sometimes it's just sometimes from an overwhelming desire to go be with that one that they have lost. When those things and those thoughts come to your mind, a person's mind, or if you have knowledge of another person, you need to get help. You need to get help as soon as possible, and certainly professional help would likely be warranted in such situations. At another program, we'll talk about looking for some warning signs. The physical aspects that come along with the grieving and the depression, a person may be very lethargic. There may be a great deal of weariness involved, and they may even have nausea. They may even be outbreaks of rashes and hives and so forth as a result of the emotional strain of a person in this difficult time, the depression that results from the grief and dealing with the loss of a loved one by the method of suicide. Medications rarely are ever the answer. Grandma's little nerve pill that you might take, that's not going to help. It may deaden and numb for now, but sedation isn't the answer. Sedation doesn't help you get through this healing process. Then there is the guilt. Guilt is sometimes magnified to those who are the survivors of a suicide situation. The questions again, could I have prevented this, will oftentimes bring guilt. What signs should I have seen? Should I have been watching for this or that, and so forth? And did I cause this? And as we've talked in other programs about guilt, we need to be very honest with ourselves, and we need to deal very seriously with the guilt, and we need to look in honesty into ourselves, and if the guilt is warranted, then we need to seek forgiveness. We need to seek God's forgiveness. We maybe need to seek the forgiveness of our family, and maybe we may feel like we need the forgiveness of the one who has passed away. But guilt is a serious obstacle in the grieving process. In being honest with ourselves about guilt, we need to look also if there's nothing for us to feel guilty about, if there's nothing we could have done to prevent it, nothing we could have done to stop it, then we have nothing to feel guilty about. And we need to be willing to forgive ourselves and deal with those things and try to move on. Some never recover from the guilt. Some carry the guilt even to their own graves. There's the question of responsibility. Who's to blame? Kind of a thing that we want resolved in our own minds. Sometimes previous confrontations, maybe in anger and arguments and so forth, sometimes those magnify the guilt, and sometimes people think they may have caused the situation. Anger at the deceased is quite common, but also sometimes brings on the guilt. Some feel that guilt, and then, some don't feel guilty, and then they feel guilty for not feeling guilty. Sort of a vicious cycle that sometimes comes about. So we have to deal with the guilt. We have to be practical, and that's hard. Some just live in denial. Some will continue with it was just an accidental overdose, or it was an accidental shooting, or an accidental hanging. All of those things that are typical methods of use by those who commit suicide, but we want to believe that they're accidental and refuse to acknowledge the truth of a situation. Some will even blame God. It's not uncommon for people to say, why did God let this happen? Was this the will of God? We need to be careful, but we need to understand where that's coming from. It's coming from the pain. It's coming from the hurt in that situation. Some will rationalize and they'll blame all kinds of reasons because they feel like they have to find the cause. I believe the solution is, as we've mentioned, I believe the solution is in God's Word. I believe as we look into God's Word, we can read about God's great forgiveness, His great mercy, His grace that is available to us if we submit ourselves to Him in obedience of faith. If we'll live according to His precepts, He'll forgive us. And so when that guilt plagues us, we need to seek forgiveness based in a confession of the cause of the guilt, if that be sin or whatever it may be. Some say things of the deceased that maybe we think they shouldn't say, or that they feel like they need to say. Sometimes it's good to get those things out. This subject is quite deep. It is quite difficult. We won't be able to cover everything in just this one program. I plan to do 3 or 4 or 5 programs on this particular subject. And so we're going to close the program for today. There will be some contact information there on your screen at the close of the program. And feel free to contact us by email, regular mail, or telephone. We'll be happy to help you in any way that we possibly can. And we certainly would invite your questions, and we pray that you'll have a great day.